Good afternoon and welcome to our latest Brussels Calling media panel. I'm Victoria Main, CEO at SEC Newgate EU, previously known as Cambre. For those not familiar with Brussels Calling, it's a chance to turn the microphone on the media and have journalists answer rather than ask questions for a change. In the interviewing seat today, we're delighted to have European Commission Vice President Margaritis Schinas, who is no stranger to working with journalists. For in addition to his political career, he was chief spokesman for the Commission from 2014 to 2019. The Vice President was also Deputy Director General at the Directorate General for the Commission's Communication DG from 2015 to 2019. Today's discussion will focus on the challenges of making sense of the EU, both inside and outside the Brussels bubble. On our panel, we will have insights from 3 journalists with extensive experience covering the EU for both insiders and outsiders. In alphabetical order, we have Leo Cendrowicz, who's currently the editor of the Brussels Times magazine and also EU correspondent for The Eye. Amongst his many other strings, Leo has been European correspondent for Hollywood Reporter, so quite some background there. Another respected figure on the EU scene is Shada Islam. Shada recently added the editorship of EU Observer magazine to her writing and thought leadership portfolio. On top of her regular speaking engagements, Shada also contributes to The Guardian, POLITICO, and other publications. Speaking of POLITICO, Suzanne Lynch returned to Brussels late last year as co-author of Playbook, so she's often in the eye of the storm. Suzanne was previously in Washington, DC with the Irish Times, having been the Brussels correspondent for the paper for 4 years. So more great insider-outsider experience there. The panel will take your questions towards the end of the discussion, so please feel free to feed them into the chat. With that, I hand over to you, Vice President Schinas, to flex your interviewing muscles. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria, and good afternoon to everybody, both the panel and the many people who follow us from a distance. Let me first thank you for this excellent idea that brings me back to my previous life of communication and talking to journalists. Let me also say that actually I was looking forward to this occasion to reverse the roles. This is something that I think would be probably an alternative career path for me. Journalism could have very well been what I would have liked to do had I not been into this adventure of European politics. So it's a test, ex post test, to see if I would have made it as a journalist. And also I want to thank Suzanne, Shada, and Leo for their courage to submit themselves to this process. You know, journalists are in a more comfortable position, I think, than politicians and spokes. Asking then replying, so it's a first, at least for me, to be able to challenge them. So let us start. I have a first question that it's the same for all 3 of them, and then I have prepared a couple of questions also more tailor-made to each of the 3 colleagues present here. But the one that I have for all of them, the horizontal one, is the following: is how do you cope with the challenge of being part of and working within the Brussels bubble, the very specific ecosystem of reporting on the EU compared to what you may think of the expectations of people outside the bubble, their interests, their right to know, their priorities. This is something that I've struggled with in my spokesperson's years when I had to recruit about 50 people for the spokesperson service, and most of them were coming from the bubble. So they were perfect in terms of the Brussels atmospherics. They knew everything about Brussels, and they were very surprised because when they saw that the first question in the job interview I held was at the time I was asking them, what's the front page news today in your home country? So where are you from? Latvia. What's top page news today in Latvia? And I was surprised that many of them didn't know. So they were, people who knew everything about the game here, but not much about the people back home who at the end of the day would be the recipients, the readers, the viewers of their work. So let me start with this challenge to our three colleagues here. How do they go about bridging this asymmetry between the self-sufficiency, the technicality, the endogamie, as the French would say, of the bubble, compared to the world out there in their home countries or in the real place of reading or viewing their results. So over to you. Let's start with Shada.
Thank you so much, Mr. Vice President. Thanks, Victoria, for having me here. And it's wonderful to be challenged this way. So as you know, Margaritis, I've always been a kind of global soul. So I've got this personality, I've got this identity, which is Euro plus. And that plus is Asian, is African, Middle Eastern, whatever have you. So I've got sort of like a sixth sense, schizophrenic if you like, but I have this lens in my sort of mind and my eye, and everything I look at when I'm working on European affairs, because that's basically what I'm doing. I'm constantly asking myself, when I'm not in Brussels, if I'm sitting in Delhi, or even in Tokyo, or if I'm sitting in Lagos, how am I going to be looking at this? So you may remember when I was a very active and assertive reporter in the press room, my questions were always about how this was related to the rest of the world. And often in the press room in those days, because this is ages ago, people would say, like, what is she asking this for? But Europe is important. Europe is very relevant to what's happening in the rest of the world. We're seeing it today, obviously, over Ukraine and Russia. But so it's a sixth sense you develop. It's a kind of additional personality that you have and a kind of reflex. Why is this important and how will I explain it to someone who's not sitting here in Brussels?
Suzanne?
Yes, hi, Margaritis. I suppose I see it that I think all journalism, one of the functions and one of the strengths of being a good journalist is communication. That's ultimately what we're trying to do. We have information and we're trying to express that for people. So I think clarity of expression, whatever format you're working with, is crucial. And you know, and in that sense, maybe it's not that different for what audience you're writing, because it's something with me. I'm in a way, I mean, Playbook, we're always talking about this in Politico, you know, who's our audience? We've got the insiders bubbles. We've also got people in national capitals or in Washington who are reading us. But always, I think when you're writing any kind of a newspaper article, you've got some people reading that piece who are highly expert on that issue. But you've other people who may not know that much. They've probably got a certain level of knowledge because they're reading it. and you have them engaged that far, but they might be the first time they're looking at, say, migration legislation or something. So I think your task as a journalist, and that's the same, is to make it relevant for all those readers, that you've got something for everybody. And even I worked for the Irish Times before, and it was the same there. You know, there's some people who'd be following the EU stuff very, very closely and would be picking up on things. You have other people who are an interest, but not that much. So I think the crucial role for us as journalists is to communicate, is to kind of analyze what's important, get all your information, and then be able to identify what's relevant, and to get past. I mean, we all joke, as we know here, about the acronyms and the words and taxonomy and gimmick and everything. And, you know, you could philosophize about that and say, is that a way of the EU kind of hiding what's really going on? And your job is to get past that. But I suppose that would be my message, that's sometimes what I think people who are not journalists don't realize, that is actually, I would think, your fundamental job, and your skill, the skills you need for that.
Yes, I still recall my exchange with Lorenzo in the press room when we were banning a pesticide on comitology. So he was asking me, pointing a finger at me, say, why are you not banning this thing? It's killing people. And I answered back saying, who is we? And then he said, well, I don't know, you are Europe, you are. And then I had to go through comitology, which is where these decisions are taken. And to explain comitology from the Commission lectern is one thing, but to be able to translate the reply into something that makes sense back home, that's another difficulty. Yeah. Now, coming to Leo, who I mean, I'm not sure how can he answer this question of Debrusselizing communication, since you are by definition editing the Brussels Times, but still I think the challenge is still the same.
Thank you, Vice President. I really appreciate this. And I have to say, I mean, we as journalists, we like to think that we're the experts in communication, but I can see that with your background and your flags, that takes more. We are getting most of. We're getting most of what you're saying, but your connection is really very weak. So I suggest that we let you somehow revisit your environment. Wi-Fi would be probably ideal, but I'm not sure. Let's give you some time, and then we'll come back to you. But really, your connection is poor. So let me now start with a more tailor-made questions again on each one of you, starting with Suzanne, who has, of course, this unique advantage of having reported from both bubbles, both from Brussels and from Washington. The only, I think that the main similarity is, of course, that both are federal capitals with very strong dimension of federal politics, with a large number of accredited journalists who get privileged access to decision makers and dedicated briefings and sessions. But I would be very much interested to hear from Suzanne what's not the same. I mean, where does she find it? Where did she find the differences between the two contexts? Over to you, Suzanne.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I mean, starting with the similarities, I was 4 years in Brussels, then I went to the US for 4.5 years, and now I'm back. But there are some similarities in that Washington, for anyone on the call here who's worked in Washington, there are similarities to Brussels in that I think one of your jobs as a journalist is to navigate the different institutions and try and work out where the real power is in those, where power is residing at a certain time. So in the, obviously here we've got the council and the parliament and the commission. In Washington it's kind of similar because you've got the White House, then you've got the legislative branch, the Capitol Hill, then you've got the State Department and the Pentagon. So that's kind of part of how they interact is a story in itself, and then where those decisions are being made. Now, when I was there, it was during the lovely Mr. Trump's reign. So in a way, and people told me, it felt it was very concentrated in the White House. You know, it really was. At the moment, probably it's a bit different because you've got Democrats in the House, and it depends who's in power. So maybe at the moment, at this very moment, there's probably a lot of State Department, you know, focus. So that's quite similar. You've also got that ecosystem of ambassadors, of journalists from all over the world, that kind of thing. But the American media, I mean, this is one of the positives about Brussels, which you alluded to there already. But, you know, it's such a rich, I mean, this is one of the reasons I came back, because I love reporting here, because it is just, there are rich pickings. You've got 27 countries with who are all sovereign and who have got different perspectives, different priorities, different desires, and a lot of them, you know, really want to shape policy to make it work for them, and they're willing to talk, and that's where the tension, and you know, stories need tension, and there's plenty of that in Brussels. In America, I found that the news media is a bit more closed. So I was quite happy. I used to get into the White House press briefings even under Trump. But I remember being there with the press briefing, and it was the day that Trump announced something about moving the embassy to Jerusalem, which was a hugely controversial story. And I remember thinking, like, nobody was asking about it, and they were just asking about whatever was happening on some legislative package on Capitol Hill. And I remember thinking, God, is this very closed? I mean, America is it's a closed media environment, and sometimes I felt it was too focused domestically. The other big difference I saw was that the power of TV. I think TV is a more important medium. Now you've got the New York Times, Washington Post, Politico, but you know, the TV is everything in the US. I mean, it's part of their culture. You know, they got the first interviews. You know, people just loved you if you're on telly. I mean, it's still a bit like that here, but it's very much so in the US, where I find in Brussels, there were even some situations where print media, as you will know, Vice President, you know, got briefed sometimes, and it was the opposite, really. So that's one difference. But then a negative, or one thing I learned, I think, and I'm sure you're aware of this, people talk about the EU's communication issues. I think there is an issue. I don't know whose fault this is, but there is a problem that in America, people, it's the old adage, who do you call when you want to call Europe? That there is not a definable person in Europe that people can identify, even in Washington. Now, this may be the fact that we don't have a president of Europe, and that there, you know, by definition, you've got these different figures. But I saw President von der Leyen on CNN last night. I saw Olaf Scholz, and I know there's been a lot of debate about the new German Chancellor and the pressure he is under in terms of policy in Washington. But I have to say, there was a German Chancellor doing his interview in English with Jake Tapper on CNN, and I was thinking, wow, that's good. I mean, that is going to be good for Europe, for the profile. So, I mean, that's a big issue, but I suppose I did get that perspective, a bit what Shada was saying there about, yes, when you're here, it feels like everything, but sometimes when you're outside of Brussels, it's even more indecipherable, and it does have to fight to get that recognition among other policy makers and other media outlets abroad.
Thank you. I'm not supposed to complement the answers, but I will abuse my position. Will do it. Well, another difference I sense between US and the EU is that the press room here is more technical. I mean, more geeky, if you like. There is more knowledge involved here, more technicality in many questions. That's why we have to have so many specialized spokes who come out. Whereas in federal politics, I mean, you are political, broad and shallow, and all the rest is not done in Washington. Thank you for that. Shada, another thing that I would like to ask you about, which I know how keen is how interested you are in reporting on migration, and how knowledgeable you are about that, is about the choice of language when approaching a subject, or a difficult one, a sensitive one, like migration. And how do you go about it? Of course, words are not innocent. I still remember that when I was preparing for my hearing in Parliament, Natasha Berthaud, who was doing migration spokes before, and she's now with me, she had written in a paper all the things that they should not say, terms, words. Never say frontline member states, because frontline is in war, not in managing migration. Never say this, never say that. So she very intelligently and effectively, I must say, she pushed me into sort of language that is universally accepted, at least in Parliament, on migration. But there is an issue there, and the choice of language, the choice of words to describe these sensitive issues. How do you feel about it?
So, Margaritis, language is power. I mean, I'm not talking in terms of Borrell, Joseph Borrell saying the power of language, because I think he's mistaken. It's the power of policies that matter. But narratives are very, very important. And I think you're absolutely right. The stories we tell ourselves about certain issues like migration come from a very deep core of values that we have. And I think what I try and do is actually, I try and be very balanced. I try and give 2 sides or 3 sides, sometimes 4 sides of the story. And Margaritis, you know, I've often said, we actually, when we talk about migration, there's someone missing in the room, migrants missing in the room. And I think we need to be very empathetic, consistent with our values. And you know that I've questioned certain terms like shield or frontline, as you said. War metaphors have no place when we're talking about human lives and people leaving war zones often to come to Europe. So I feel very strongly about European values. I feel very strongly about our unity and diversity. I feel very strongly about inclusion. And some of the language that I think our politicians are using comes from a very hard place, because we have been corrupted by the far right narrative on the other, the exclusive us and them narrative that is coming from a very bad, corrosive place. And my concern really is, and you know I've said this very often, is that we're being hijacked into a narrative which is very, very poisonous. And my plea is, I have to say, is let's become balanced and let's put humanity first. Doesn't mean we are not tough on migration. We have to manage it, but we can manage it in a humane way. And that's where language matters. I was very upset, I'll be very frank with you, when Ursula von der Leyen went to Greece and talked about Greece being a shield for migrants coming in. That's the kind of language that gives Europe a poor name, a poor reputation, when we know that in fact, the reality of Europe's migration policies are very different. If you see what's happening in cities, major cities, how open the mayors are, how much we need migration. So I think language is important, but the policies, Margaritis, are very important. But you can convey the policies in a softer, more humane, empathetic manner, and sometimes it's the case at the moment.
Thank you. Let's move now to Leo, hoping that his connection is better, has improved. Leo, I saw that you have written extensively in the last few weeks, in particular about the possible invasion of Russia in Ukraine. And this raises, at least for me, as an interesting question. How would a journalist go about an evolving story? I mean, covering an evolving story of that importance and of that intensity is not a simple thing, because one thing is that you sort of set out the facts of the day, but at some point in time, in stories of such magnitude, a journalist unavoidably would have to take a stance as to what's next, what will happen next. So how do you go about it? And looking back at what you wrote on Russia, Ukraine, how much you think you were vindicated by the course of events?
Thank you for that question. Actually, I was supposed to be in Kiev a couple of weeks ago, but I caught COVID, and unfortunately, COVID seems to be the only other dominant feature on our agenda at the moment. It's difficult to try and find nuances when you can see that there's a creeping threat, and journalists, like anyone, like policymakers, can worry about what's going on and trying to raise awareness in about where it's going. And I think in our position we can try lots of different angles, make it a bit more personal, explain our articles, just break it down into different bite-sized chunks, which make it a bit more digestible for the readers. When I was going to go to Kiev, I had a whole list of people I wanted to interview who could just explain what life is like living under this shadow and the menace of almost 200,000 troops on your border. It's just something which is unimaginable here in Brussels, in the Brussels bubble, and try a sense of what they feel so that we can make it a bit more engaging. Because that is it. It's trying to the reader, get them to what is really going on, make them empathize with the real challenges that people on the other side of the world, people who don't get the we have, who are facing war and famine and all sorts of other terrors. Get them to understand that.
Interesting. Thank you. Back to Suzanne. As you can imagine, I get many calls, talk to many people, and I am one of the things that strikes me that many times many of these people call me on things that they read in Playbook. Playbook is of course widely read, not only in Brussels, but I think it's also very popular with a certain kind of people in the capitals, those who work on European affairs, and early in the morning they need something that sums it up so that they can then go deeper into the stories. But it's very important that they get the menu of the day from Playbook, and that's why I'm getting these calls. So many times I'm getting calls, and I understand, because I read Playbook too, that this is a follow-up question of something that they read in Playbook. So my question to you, Suzanne, is how do you and your colleague go about writing this thing? I mean, do you act as a collector of news, ideas? People pick up the phone and tell you, or do you have your own ideas of where the center of gravity of a news day would be, and then start crafting the product? Actually, I always wanted to ask you this.
Yeah, loads of people. It's kind of, well, for the first time in Playbook Brussels, we have 2 people. Before that, we just had 1 person. And in America, they have 4. I'm not quite sure how they do that, but it's a lot of work, I can tell you. I've never worked this hard in my life. I can tell you it's a lot of work to put it together. But myself and my colleague Jakob, we work very well together. We are complementary. We're a bit too alike in personality, though. We're both quite dramatic, so that's probably not a good thing. Florian was calmer. Ryan wasn't, but we are. But Well, I mean, look, a lot of the times we both work on two things. We've tried a few things, and we're now in a system which we've hit on, which is that one of us will take the lead for a week with the other kind of coming in. So this week it's Jakub in the lead. Now we're in a very specific week because it's Russia. I mean, it's a different kind of a week than it usually is. So it's an obvious lead. But what I like about it, I mean, every newspaper has this problem, or every TV bulletin, has Le Monde every day has to have something on the front page. I mean, you have to make a decision, and sometimes it's obvious and sometimes it's not. So I think one of the things we're trying to do is to kind of keep it varied. So some people might be interested in migration, but some people might be more interested in, Eurozone inflation. We're also trying to kind of do, to try and say for inflation, for example, we did quite a bit in the autumn when I started on energy prices, on the fact that this was really resonating in national capitals. So even though our colleagues in the political pro were on the details of taxonomy and the details of energy policy, it was trying to make that a bit, zoom out a little bit more. But the ideal, I mean, obviously, as you know, the problem for all, or the challenge for all journalists, is that people speak to us, and we have to try and step back and analyze that. There's a reason why somebody is spinning to us. There's a reason they're giving us that information. And in an ideal world, you're making calls and you're trying to, stand it up. But that's all. Again, it's a bit, even though there's a very unique style of Playbook, the principles are the same. Journalism is the same. You identify what's relevant, why it's important, and then you try and you're accurate and you back it up. But that's the way we work. We've an Australian editor. This is the mystery of how it all works, is that we've an editor who's in Australia, Zoya, who did work in Brussels, and she picks it up and she edits it and sends it out. At one point last year, I was getting up at 6 o'clock in the morning and Jakub was staying up late. Anyway, that all ended very quickly because it was too much. But that's what we do. That's the way it works. And I really like that system. It's quite interesting. A lot of media organizations are now doing that, are using staff in Asia Pacific for their online offering all night. So that works very well for us. And then we interact with our colleagues in the office too. But the challenge, I'm not going to lie, is the amount of stuff. Like Playbook London, for example, which is great, but it's got the one market and the one, it's just got what's going on in Westminster. Whereas, as we said, there's so many different themes going on here. We have to try and cover everything. Like, for example, we did something. We meet sources. I've just been meeting somebody, a senior person, for lunch. I'm going off to meet somebody from a US delegation now when I finish this. Some of the stuff will go in tomorrow, but other stuff, that's how it works. You get info, and then maybe in a few weeks. So, for example, in the last 2 weeks, we did something on Mali. Nobody was really, the French were covering it, but we realized, we need to write something on Mali. This is going to erupt. We did, and then last week it did. There's a big announcement about France pulling out, the implications of the EU. So that's easily a story we could have missed, but it was important to do it at some point. Similarly, we made a decision about 3 weeks ago. We haven't done anything on the Balkans. We know this, stuff is getting serious there. We didn't have had a chance to do it, but we're doing that now. We're making a conscious decision to get to topics that we haven't covered. And someday you have the freedom to just do that if you want, and that's quite gratifying. I kind of like that about the format.
Okay, thanks. I hope that Jakub is following this exchange, because I very much look forward to read the Playbook tomorrow. Shada, they say that to have a nice dinner, one has to refrain from discussing money, politics, and religion. But I know that you have been reporting consistently on religion, on Islam, on the French debate about identity and religion, not only the French. But I wanted to ask you whether you find this easy or difficult to do from Brussels, and how does this fit in the overall tonality of EU coverage?
So, Margaritis, I do two things. I'm working on geopolitics, all of this Africa, Asia, Middle East, trade, security, you name it, geopolitical, I'm covering it. But since 9/11, given my surname, I've been drawn into the discussion on Islam and integration, and of course, all the related issues to do with racism and anti-racism. And since that, I was actually drawn into it without really realizing what was happening to me, because I'm not a scholar on Islam, and I don't, to tell you the truth, I don't come to it from a religious point of view. I come to it from an equality agenda. We are supposed to be a union of equality. And as I said in my earlier response to you, I'm a firm believer in European values of inclusion and diversity. I'm thrilled and I take advantage of the fact that I live in democracies. Some of the things I write, some of the criticism I make of the authorities, to be very frank with you, I could not make it many parts of the world. Many of the readers who read me are actually quite surprised that I'm so open and that I can do so. So I take that privilege very seriously. I believe in speaking truth to power, because I know that it's coming from a constructive place. So it is difficult, it's difficult, but it is essential, Margaritis, because this is the union of equality. Von der Leyen has promised a fair and humane, and we have made promises about fighting racism, not just after Black Lives Matter and the killing of George Floyd, but it's part of our DNA. So I just keep saying and writing about that. As I said, it's more about the fact that we are all citizens of Europe, and they shouldn't be first class or second class citizens. And of course, writing about France in these days, with the elections coming up, it's a very delicate situation. We definitely don't want to aggravate the divisions that exist in that lovely country. We don't want to aggravate it, but I think it's also important to call out when politicians are making very dangerous choices in the words they use, in the way they describe the other. And these things are very personal to me, but as I said, I don't come to it from religion. I come to it from an equality agenda. And I think that's very important to underline, because you can see my name and you'll say, oh, but she's coming to it because she's of Muslim descent. Actually, I am of Muslim descent, but I'm above all, a European.
Great, thank you for that. Leo, I remember one of the best things we did during the Juncker Commission is when we presented when the Commission decided to reinforce the mandate of Frontex and rename it as European Border and Coast Guard with new competencies, more resources, more role. We took the decision with Juncker and Avramopoulos to present the proposal not in the Commission press room in Brussels, but in the border between Greece, Bulgaria, and Turkey. So we moved there the day of the decision. We were on the border. We had guards, we had dogs, we had the border, we had everything. And it was a big success. It was a huge success in terms of visibility, in terms of media pickup. So the question is, of course, when I came back, one of the first things that was expecting me in the office was a démarche from the association of the Brussels-based journalists saying that this is not the way to do it. This is Brussels. We have to keep some leverage for the accredited press. So my question is, how do you see the tolerance level of Brussels media correspondents to events happening outside of Brussels but still have a strong EU dimension? I mean, whether this is something that you as a Brussels-based journalist would be interested in seeing, or you see that something that runs counter against what what your own priorities would be as a Brussels-based hub?
That's an interesting question. I first point out that I'm old enough to remember when the EU summits would go around the rotating presidencies countries, and they weren't just in Brussels, and that was always a good opportunity to actually get to know the country, and not just to write about it, but also, you know, let's be honest, as journalists, we like to get out and visit these far-flung countries, well, relatively to Brussels. A second observation is to think about, I mean, Suzanne was mentioning her time in Washington. It's the same, I suppose it's the same challenge there. There are lots of correspondents in Washington who just goes off on journeys around the country. You know, some of them might go, some of them not. The Frontex announcement you made, that sounds like it's a very good idea to put it out, do it outside. But you know, the question is, who in the Brussels media bubble would we actually be able to jump on the plane and do that? I mentioned the EU summits during the presidencies, and we used to charter a plane for the journalists to go over it, as easy as you might imagine to get out and about. I would say it's very important for journalists simply to get out and visit as many countries as they can if they're in Brussels, if they have the resources, if the newspaper had the resources. And one of the reasons I decided to do the editing of the Brussels Times magazine is simply because it gave me more opportunities to meet people in the Brussels bubble, in the EU bubble. It's so easy to get involved in the swirl of the exciting swirl of the European multinational vortex, and it is very exhilarating, different people coming in, but so many people just don't get to know what's going on in Brussels, in Belgium, and I wanted to make sure that people did explore that, and that's important, not just for people who live here, the readers, but just even for the European Commission and their officials and the other officials in the EU institutions who lose touch with the average people on the street. I mean, I've lost count of the amount of people in the Commission who I speak to who say, I've been living here for 10 years and I don't actually know any Belgians. And that gets back to the real point of connecting with people, connecting with and understanding your audience. And that goes for both journalists and for politicians as well. So I applaud you going out and doing these press events outside, but also be aware it helps if we can come along too.
Understood. Now I have another question, which is the same for all of you, which in a way is linked to Leo's previous reply, which is the following. You know, the Commission, you know how the Commission recruits people. We have open competitions, merit-based, with a certain geographic balance. So we get top people from good universities specialized in EU affairs with a competitive edge, good lawyers, good economists, good environment specialists, and so on and so forth. But this does not necessarily brings into the system good communicators. Actually, even when we organize competitions for communication specialists, we still get EU specialists who have some experience in communication. So that's a difficulty for the Commission. And another difficulty is that once you are within the Commission and you climb up the ladder and you do more and more and more important things, you have a tendency to concentrate on your hamster wheel, you know, which is normally your DG, your policy specialization, the stakeholders around you, your hierarchy, the cabinet, the commissioners. Bref, this does not help. This does not help the Commission to project good communications. I'm telling you, I was in the middle of all this. I would never forget that some moments I would invite, especially for technical briefings, senior managers from the Commission to come to the Commission room, press room, and I would see them surprised that the Commission has a press room. It was actually the first time they ever set foot in the press room. So with this in mind, I would like to ask all three of you, what are the parts that you see that the Commission is good at in communicating? I mean, what are the positives of Commission communication, and what are the parts that you don't like, and where you think that the Commission is doing a poor job in the communication? And please feel free to be frank. I mean, this is, after all, an interview, so it's not a lecture. Suzanne, you start.
I suppose the positives, and again comparing it to the US, although they did this too, was, you know, the technical briefings are important. I think they're very, very good. That, you know, that gives us the knowledge and the in-depth go down into the weeds that we can report it correctly. So I like that. I think it's a very positive part of what the Commission offers. I suppose one of the issues all the time, and I don't know what the answer to this is the language issue. You know, what language you communicate in. You know, not everybody's a native English speaker. Like that's difficult. But, you know, Commissioner, I saw you down in the Munich Security Conference. I don't know about you, but like listen to all the speakers, the key speakers. I mean, I was Zelensky, the president of Ukraine. I just thought he was and he was speaking through a translator. Now, I suppose it was the big moment in his life, maybe, the point he was in. But he was he gave such an example of a good speech, I felt. He was authentic. He communicated. He some really good kind of rhetorical things where he zoned into about 3 or 4 issues for the West. He said, you know, if you're telling us they're going to invade, why aren't you doing the sanctions now? It's going to be too late for us when they're already, you know, he made these really clear. And yet I'd heard, you know, Kamala Harris and other people giving speeches, and I kind of finished the speech and I couldn't really tell you what they said. So I remember thinking, actually, you know what, it's not all about the language. And if you've got something to say and you can put it across and you come across as real and authentic and that you're not scripted, it can work. So I kind of really came away from thinking about that. So I suppose it must be difficult for officials and commissioners. They have to be careful what they say, obviously, but as much as they can to get away from the script, I always think kind of helps people communicate and get that message across.
Thank you, Shada.
I agree with Suzanne. You know, it is, Margaritis, is about authenticity. It's about bringing emotion. Facts are very important, very, very important, but it's how you convey them with a story around them. And I think this is somehow, when you become very slick and you're becoming propagandists and PR stuff, you know, you lose that authenticity of feeling. And I think sometimes I do worry that I'm not in touch with spokespeople as much as I used to be, because I'm an op-ed writer, a columnist. I'm not doing the reporting that Suzanne is doing, but I do talk to a lot of people. And that sense of coming out of a truthful place, a sincere place, I think is very, very important. I still remember discussions with your previous boss, you know, Jean-Claude Juncker, and during the migration so-called crisis that we talk about in 2015, he made a speech in the parliament where he spoke so much from the heart. I was gobsmacked. And I told Martin Selmayr that. I said, you know, this time this man is really speaking from the heart. And he said yes. And then that was a very short-lived moment, unfortunately. But when politicians, commissioners including, speak truth, emotional, it doesn't have to be sentimental, but I think that's what Suzanne is referring to. I mean, I do podcasts quite a bit now, and they're sort of directed towards a foreign global audience. And if I get an EU official, I have to spend minutes, half an hour or so, saying no use of words like subsidiarity. Please don't talk about acquis. Don't talk about taxonomy. Just say things clearly. And then we have to go through it, editing. It takes time, but this happens a lot. And one thing that I'm also a great advocate of is diversity, cognitive diversity. I'm not saying just to get more brown and black people into your recruitment, into your staff, but do that too, please. And you really have to be serious about that, because you're going to get cognitive diversity. A lot of them will be very good, a lot of them will be very bad, but you need people who think differently, who can look at a campaign, a PR campaign or a communication campaign that you're doing and say, hey, these are all white hands. Europe is diverse and multicultural. Could we have some color in that picture as well? Or say, don't paint an Asian to seem like a nasty person. There are some very good ways of portraying diversity. So you've made big mistakes. The Commission has made huge mistakes in its PR campaigns because you lack that cognitive diversity. There's a great book that's out there called Rebel Ideas. And it shows how people who look alike, homogenous thinkers coming out of the same university, same kind of background, fail in many ways to make policies that are actually not relevant to the real world that they are working in. So I would really encourage that kind of inclusiveness, not based on some kind of charitable work, but because it's going to lead to better outcomes, better policies. And that's one way of tackling the issue that you talked about, also migration, or all the different inequality agendas that we're tackling. Get to speak to the people who are actually on the receiving end of some of those policies, and then see how you can improve things. Sorry, I do tend to lecture a lot.
No, that's good.
I'm sorry about that, but it's sort of become part of my DNA now. I also lecture students.
That's good, and I have three quick comments on what you just said. I hope the rules of engagement allow for comments. The first on taxonomy, I read an interview between the two Irish ladies, my colleague Mairead and Suzanne, which was, it made sense. It was very good because the taxonomy, as discussed between Suzanne and Mairead, was put in terms that people actually could follow. On Juncker, there was something else, not only Jean-Claude's, of course, empathy and social skills. There was something else that one should not forget, that Jean-Claude was coming from the political culture of a small member state, where being a politician means talking to people direct. You're coming out of the government office and then you are with the people. I still remember when we were coaching him in the transition team with Selmayr and others, and Martin would tell him, Jean-Claude, you need a head of cabinet and a deputy head of cabinet and a diplomatic advisor and an economist and a chief spokesman and a deputy chief spokesman. And Juncker would say, why? Why do I need all these people? Because in his political culture, this is not actually necessary. You talk to people, you communicate to people, you interact with people. Whereas in the Commission, being the mammoth that we are, of course, this structure is necessary. Final point on diversity. Yes, there I fully agree with you. And I think that there are two pending issues, at least for the College of Commissioners, where there is a certain discretion, since this is a dialogue between the member state government that proposes and the president of the Commission that accepts the nomination. I think that there are two pending issues on diversity. One is, I think, a non-white commissioner is called for, and I'm sure it will come in the next commission. I think that would be very powerful signal also in terms of representing the Europe as it is now. And another one, and you will be surprised to hear this from an EPP commissioner, is that I think we need also a commissioner from the left. We had a Green commissioner in the past, but not a GUE commissioner. So probably these two pending issues also will be sorted out. Leo, over to you for the final reply to the final question, and then I hand over to Victoria.
I would build on what Shada and Suzanne have been saying, which is it's not just about authenticity, it's also about confidence. There were so many occasions I would love to come out and say things in a more relaxed and bold manner, but I so often see the officials and the commissioners just almost paralyzed by a fear of criticism from journalists, from their home member states, from ministers and prime ministers, and the you can really feel the bureaucracy which is sitting in their messaging, because it's been down and rewritten by committee, and it sucks away, it drains away any sense of any direct, clear messaging. And so that's why I think that the authenticity is also a status of a belief system in some ways, a feeling within the Commission, within the EU, that they have a message, they have the means to come up with a policy and deliver it. But so often it just gets hidden behind jargon and defensive talking points. Yeah, so I totally agree with you what you say about what's been said about Jean-Claude Juncker, because I interviewed him last year, and post-presidency he was a very different character, but he was definitely authentic when he had the chance, and we need more people like him in many ways. Whatever you think about his policies, we need more people and who aren't afraid of any backlash. So yes, authenticity, absolutely.
Thank you. Well, I don't know about you guys, I enjoyed it a lot. Victoria, over to you.
I feel like a real party pooper winding up this really brilliant debate. Thank you very much, Vice President Schinas, Shada, Suzanne, and Leo for these fascinating insights on the challenges of communication from all sides of the table, really. Shada, as you say, you're an editorialist. Suzanne, you're in the line of fire at Politico, and Leo, you cover Brussels from a variety of angles. And as a former journalist turned consultant, working very much in the area of communications, I just, found every word fascinating. It's a conversation we could revisit. So I thank, and I would say, Vice President Schinas, if you really are looking for a change of career, you're a natural and you seem to enjoy it. So, which is the main thing. So thank you very much. Thanks to our audience who've joined from various places, including somebody from Japan. So watch the space for the next Brussels Calling Media Debate.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.